Hello, everyone. This is the Pro-Labor Conservative Podcast. I'm your host, David Graves. Thank you so much for joining us. Today's guest is responsible for preserving one of the nation's most important union monuments, a true symbol of the American union movement. In his new book, The Road to Blair Mountain, he takes us on his journey to save a little-known battlefield from a little-known war in the middle of West Virginia. The book takes us along as he navigates a world dominated by the coal industry, from politics to law enforcement, in one of the most misunderstood states in our union. Charles Keeney, welcome to the Pro-Labor Conservative Podcast. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, David. I appreciate you bringing me on.
So I want to get into the book and I want to dive in deep to Blair Mountain. But before that, I kind of wanted to get your take on current events. I wanted to talk to you about what's happening with the Keystone Pipeline workers, because I'm seeing some pretty big similarities between what's happening now at the national level regarding individuals who work in oil and gas on the labor side of things, and what's been happening in West Virginia since the beginning of the Green Revolution. And my concern is that the push for green energy is leaving these workers behind. These are the workers that powered our society and brought us to this point. And I wanted to kind of get your take on that.
It's obviously a really complicated situation. The conventional political wisdom out there obviously tends to put labor unions and environmentalists both under the left umbrella, right? However, what you see is industrial unions, everything from the United Mine Workers to the steel workers to pipeline workers unions. Obviously, they are going to be, shall we say, a little more hesitant to make this transition to clean energy when their jobs and their existence is up for grabs. I mean, you can obviously see that these unions, the AFL-CIO, for example, Richard Trumka, whenever Trump in 2017 put the green light back on the Dakota pipeline, Trumka praised the decision. The AFL-CIO praised the decision as it meant potentially more union jobs. So while it was decried on the environmental left, the biggest labor organization in America, the AFL-CIO, was supportive of what a conservative Republican, if you want to refer to Trump in that, he doesn't quite fit so neatly under that umbrella, but you get the point. So you have labor unions that are supporting these policies because they've not yet been given viable alternatives. A lot of people talk about a phrase that I really hate is called just transition. I'm sure you've heard this used a lot.
Mm-hmm.
This is often used sometimes in the environmental community, sometimes on the left, sometimes in proponents of the Green New Deal, saying we have to have a just transition in these regions. But the problem is that ship has already sailed in many of these places, particularly in coal country, because the towns have already depleted, schools have already shut down, businesses have already closed. It's not exactly a transition at this point. Everything's already bottomed out. It's a little late for a transition. You can talk about a rebuild or a renewal or reimagining things, but the idea of a just transition, that ship has already sailed. And these issues are obviously going to be bigger as the push for this gigantic energy change. And we're not just talking about the way in which we produce electricity, but transportation, construction, all of these things are going to undergo dramatic transformations. It's not going to be appealing to a pipe worker or an oil worker or a coal miner or somebody who's on a natural gas rig to say, you left high school, you went straight into a blue collar job, and this has been your livelihood. You're married, you've got kids. And now suddenly we're saying we want you to go back to school for 18 months and train for a job in, say, solar panels or whatever, and put your life on hold and potentially, your kids' future and all this stuff so that you can transition to a job that doesn't yet exist. So obviously there's going to be some tension because a lot of workers aren't thinking 10 years ahead to the impacts of climate change. They're thinking 2 weeks ahead to the next paycheck.
What I felt was really interesting was that Biden had this executive order. It was a big deal. We kind of knew it was going to happen. There was talk about it, but he pulls an executive order that basically suspends or actually revokes the permit for the Keystone.
Right.
But there was no discussion about what's going to happen to these workers. There was no discussion about, well, are we going to have an emergency FEMA declaration so that we can have enhanced unemployment for these particular workers who are now out of work during a pandemic? Or, there's no real discussion. And I find that I see this happening in the union world too, is there's really no real discussion about what we do with these people who have been working a good job, but a job nonetheless that is going to change, but it's not their fault, and we're expecting them to continue to produce the energy we need while we make this transition. But then what happens to these workers? That what I hate is kind of what you refer to as this whole retraining concept. It's not easy for you to go to school when you still have to pay the bills, when you still have to take care of your kids, when you still have to make the mortgage payment, and then when you lose your job, you really aren't thinking about going to school. You're thinking about whatever job you can get to keep income coming in. Coming from a blue collar family myself, I can relate to that. So it's very difficult for me to stomach what's happening right now on the labor side of things, and understanding that we do need to transition, understanding we do need to go to cleaner energy. I mean, not just because of the environmental impact, but let's face it, it's just a sustainable route and it's more economically viable.
Right. And something I said back in 2016 before the election, I mentioned that this transition, the market is going to push this transition anyway, regardless as to who gets elected, because as things like solar become cheaper and better and the technology improves, it's just going to outcompete things like coal in the marketplace. But yes, that leaves workers out. And it also, in addition, like a place like West Virginia, so the coal industry bottoms out really in the last 10 years. The coal industry has suffered a very significant drop off. And it's not just the loss in unemployment, of course, but it's these communities whose entire livelihoods depend upon a single industry. And so businesses shut down, people move away, and the tax base. And that's another thing that while the coal industry, I could talk for a long time about the complicated legacy of the coal industry in West Virginia. But one of the things that they did do is because it was taxed, it provided a huge tax base to fund schools and roads. And now that the industry has plummeted, where are we going to get that tax money, that tax base from? Now, it may rejuvenate in another 10 years or so if you transform the economy. But right now, it's very lean times, not just for families that have been put out of work, but also for communities that depend on those tax dollars. So schools are getting really pinched with funding, particularly in the coal counties. They're having to lay off teachers and things like this. And so there aren't any easy answers.
So it's almost as if what's happened on the reservations, I refer to it as almost like a cultural genocide, at the idea that you basically you get rid of the tax base, there's no more money, the kids don't get the education they need, they can't advance, and then you get this welfare cyclical cycle that starts and you just can't get out of it. And so it seems like these left-leaning policies are not covering all the bases. They want to present the change, they want to make these big things happen. They're not pushing from the perspective of the worker getting out of this situation.
Right, and it is they're not covering all the bases. There was Obama's Power Plus plan, which was going to pump some money into the region, but of course it never went through. But it's this idea that if we just throw money at it and put, allow community colleges and places to open up alternative programs and job training for people to come into. Again, it's such a tough scenario because you're expecting people to put their lives on hold for this transition, and there's also a kind of a psychological aspect to it that these in places where you have single industries that dominate a region, that becomes part of the regional identity, and it's difficult for people to psychologically break away from that. And they begin to think, well, this is all we've ever had. We kind of don't know what else to do. This is kind of in our blood. And it's difficult to get people to embrace that. And there's logical reasons that people are going to have trouble embracing that because they have to completely disrupt their lives. But this is a problem that we have to figure out in all of these rural communities.
Well, with all that said,
Yeah.
I just want you to break this down for me. Why in God's green earth would you go up against the West Virginia coal industry, the political establishment in West Virginia, the union establishment, the general public? Why would you go up against all these forces just to protect a piece of land on the top of a mountain somewhere in rural West Virginia?
It's a good question. It's a good question. Uh, when I first got involved, I at first just had a gut reaction. I had been living in Morgantown for a number of years, which is in the northern part of the state, where West Virginia University is, a school of 30,000 people. It's very different than the rest of the state. The majority of students are not from West Virginia. I got tons of kids from New Jersey, believe it or not, at West Virginia University because they can go to school cheaper there than they can, say, to Rutgers or something like that. But anyway, so it's a very different animal than the rest of the state. And then I come back down to southern West Virginia where I grew up, and I found a place that had been really transformed very quickly. When I left, there was no such thing, for example, as Friends of Coal or this huge campaign that the coal industry was waging. It was really ramped up in the years that I was gone. And their control, both politically and economically, and even culturally and psychologically, seemed more powerful than ever. When I saw that they had delisted this battlefield, first of all, I just kind of assumed it was already on the National Register of Historic Places. I had never really checked into it. I just kind of naturally assumed that it's a place that was going to be going to be preserved. And when I found out that the industry was planning to wipe it out with mountaintop removal, I had a gut reaction to it that just infuriated me that they would try to uh, destroy this site. And when I began to teach classes at the small college I was at in Logan, the students who lived, less than 10 miles away from the battlefield, many of them had never even heard about it. And it just made me really, really angry. And that's what really got me involved in it. I felt that if we could win over the general public over time, that we could defeat the industry. And I did take a long time to kind of weigh the cost of it. It obviously, as you mentioned, the industry controls everything. At the college where I was working, the governor's wife was the president of the college. The governor was a Democrat, pro coal Democrat, one of these old school West Virginia Democrats, Earl Ray Tomlin. And so I was worried about my job. I was worried also about violence towards me. My family was very worried about that because environmental activists had been, physically attacked and things like that. And if I was going to do this march, which we did this huge protest march to stop mountaintop removal, the industry was going to try to throw this, he's just some environmental hippie, one of these, lefty professors who has his head up in the clouds and doesn't know how the real world works. And I understood that I would be lumped into all of those things. But at the same time, I'm not the type of person that is defeatist. And for whatever reason, I didn't see defeat as an option. I'm not one of these we'll give it our best shot and see what happens kind of guys. I'm one of these we're going to win and I'm going to find a way to win. My great grandfather found a way to win. And so I'm going to do the same. And so I just went into it with that attitude.
There's two opposing forces here. There's the historic value of the site, and then there's of course the environmental impact, and so there's the environmentalists. But I have to admit, I'm pretty well informed, and I really care about labor issues, obviously. And I had no idea until a dear friend of mine, Kyle Warmack, who ended up going out to West Virginia, he sent me this book, and I read it, and it was about Blair Mountain. Blown away. Tell me a little. I mean, I don't think people understand. There was a full on battlefield.
Yeah. Okay. So the Battle of Blair Mountain is considered by many to be the culmination of the West Virginia mine wars. And with the mine wars, you have this really, really bloody and protracted labor conflict, which takes place in West Virginia roughly from 1912 through the early 1920s. And West Virginia was kind of a unique situation. Coal operators in West Virginia felt that they had to keep the UMWA and keep the miners from unionizing. The reason that they felt that is because West Virginia geographically is further away from the major industrial centers, Detroit, Chicago, Buffalo, New York. And therefore, coal fields in Illinois, even Indiana, Western Pennsylvania, these coal fields had a big advantage over the West Virginia coal fields in the sense that they were closer and they could ship their coal cheaper. So these coal operators in these other states made union contracts, and the union was able to organize in those states, and they were able to sell their coal cheaper. So the coal industry in West Virginia developed an alternative system of keeping the union out and creating this company town system that enabled them by the early 1900s to sell coal cheaper, even though they had to ship it further away, by keeping the union out and by this company town system. I guess let me talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, please.
You have a lot of places in rural West Virginia, particularly in the southern part of the state, that were underdeveloped, that didn't have a lot of towns before the railroads came through. And it's in the late 1800s, 1880s, that geologic surveys begin to reveal the vast amounts of coal that were in southern West Virginia. And once that happens, outside investors begin coming in, and they come up with something called the broad form deed, which is essentially mineral rights, the ability to buy the coal and the minerals that are underneath the soil of the people that were living there. And a lot of people were forced off their land or kind of swindled out of their land. And what they would do is they would drive off some of these mountaineer families, like my own family that owned 2,000 acres on Cabin Creek. They kind of drove those families off their land and came in and took it. And then they began building towns just to accommodate the coal mines. So they built up these company towns for the company store, company saloon, company hotel, company church, company school. Everything's run by the company. They hire the teachers, they hire the preacher, they pay you in company money or scrip. One of my favorite pieces in the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum, which we'll probably talk about later on, we have tons of pieces of script, but we have one piece of script that just says "good for one loaf of bread," and that's it. And some miner was paid that around 100 years ago, or a little bit longer. And if for anybody working in the United States under a free enterprise system, if your employer gives you a piece of money or a payment and you have no control over your own consumerism, you have no control over what you can buy, and you had to go shop at the company store, you could maybe go out of the company town and find another store, but your company money isn't going to exchange for the same price as an American dollar. So they control where you shop, they control where you spend the money. Many of the miners didn't have homes. They brought in a lot of immigrants and African Americans from the South. And so they brought them in, put them in company houses. They didn't have money to pay the first month's rent. So you give them a month's advance at the company store. You give them an advance to pay for their groceries. And they also have to pay for their own equipment, their picks, their lamps, their canaries, canaries in their cages for the canaries. They have to pay for all that. And then they get fronted all that at the company store. So they start out in debt. And if you are in debt over your head from day one, that's one of the things that puts you trapped in a system and prevents upward mobility. So they don't have upward mobility. They're stuck in a debt system, and they're stuck in a system where the company controls consumerism. It controls where they can go. They also it controls what they can buy, everything, every aspects of their lives. I mean, there's an old poem called "The Company Town," and it talks about the company preacher teaches what the company thinks is right, and uh, so it's this idea of complete control, and it's not the way capitalism is supposed to work, obviously. But on top of that, because these were company towns, they brought in company security guards that were known as mine guards. And these guys wouldn't allow union meetings to take place. They were always spying. Some of them operated undercover as saloon keepers or bartenders or even as miners. They wrote letters of what they were hearing and what they were listening to. They opened your mail. And sometimes, even on election days, we have examples of miners just lining up and the mine guards just filling out their ballots for them, uh, and rigging elections. So if you're in a situation where your vote doesn't matter, your money isn't even American, and the mine guards, who could be very heavy-handed and brutal at times, you have to ask yourself, is this America? And so miners then began organizing themselves. And eventually, when they try all other obstacles, they didn't immediately grab their guns and start firing back. They tried appealing to the governors. They even tried appealing to larger union movements. The UMWA was scared to send organizers into Cabin Creek. And that's when my great grandfather took over the Cabin Creek strike, because the union was too afraid to send in organizers because of the mine guards. So he said, I'll take over the strike myself. And ultimately, he did, and they won. And then this culminated, of course, later on in the Battle of Blair Mountain. It was Pink Creek and Cabin Creek and the strikes that took place after World War One. Miners organized themselves into guerrilla units. They systematically attacked coal towns, trains. They blew up tipples. They dislodged train tracks. You had a lot of women that did that, actually, took crowbars and would dislodge the train tracks so they couldn't bring in replacement workers, or scabs, as the union folks would call them. There were numerous gunfights, several at the coal town of Mucklow, in which upwards of 15, 16 people were killed. You had the 3 days Battle of the Tug in May of 1921, where at least somewhere around 30 people were killed. State troopers were brought in and they got pinned down, and they had to ultimately have a ceasefire after 3 days of fighting when they got a local doctor with a white flag to go into the woods and negotiate a truce. You had the Mate 1 massacre, which killed 10 people. And then ultimately, you have the Battle of Blair Mountain.
You just kind of went over this entire basically indentured servitude system that was in the United States after the Civil War. I mean, you essentially have basically legal slavery. Did the outside world know this? I mean, did we just ignore it?
Couple of things. First of all, for union organizers, it was very difficult to make it into these coal towns that are isolated, and in many cases, the only way in and out is by train. And so they have mine guards posted at all the train depots. And so when you get out, particularly in Logan County, where Don Chafin was the sheriff, and he was paid somewhere over $100,000 a year by the Logan County Co-operators Association. Imagine, 100,000 a year in 1920. Okay,
Jeez.
and he had 300 deputies in Logan County. If you and because I know the town of Logan and I know Logan County well, that's a ridiculous number for this county. I think today there's 4 cops in Logan County.
Wow.
But you go back 100 years, you had 300, and they would check when you walked out off the train. They were there to see who you were, what your business in town. So it was very difficult for organizers to even penetrate this region. That's part of the explanation. Another part of the explanation is this stereotype of Appalachia, which was fostered to begin with the Hatfield and McCoy feud, which this very famous event in American lore that took place in the same spot where a lot of the events of the mine wars took place, actually. And there's a lot of we could talk about the feud for a really long time, but to summarize, this was a feud that really was a land dispute over the fact that the railroad was coming through, and they found out that there was a lot of coal in the Tug Valley. But it was portrayed in the media as these backward, uneducated, violent hillbillies that are all drunk on moonshine and they just want to murder one another, and basically they were in the way of progress. And therefore, whenever there was violence that would erupt in the coal fields afterwards, the national media would portray it as these are just backwards hillbillies. That's just what they do. Somebody will shoot you just for looking at them the wrong way in that part of the country. And so the explanation for the violence got to be these stereotypes that we're familiar with, these hillbilly and redneck stereotypes. And that became the explanation for what was happening, as opposed to the miners are being mistreated. You have this company town system, they don't own their own land. This was a much easier explanation, and it made it more dismissive. People were able to be more dismissive, I should say, of these people losing their land and trying to fight back.
It's hard to imagine that, in the 20s, this, where we were the roaring 20s, and we were advancing. It's just so hard to imagine that not that far from the, on the same coast, on the same side of this country as New York City,
Right.
where all this incredible innovations happening, there are towns where you can only get there with a on rail that are literally slave towns. I can't think of a better way to explain what it is or articulate what that was.
Yeah, there were some African American miners that wrote the United Mine Workers Journal and compared the situation that they were in to slavery. Um, it's or industrial servitude. Samuel Gompers referred to the situation in West Virginia as industrial autocracy. So you have those types of comparisons that were made. Uh, Mother Jones, who came to West Virginia, often called it medieval West Virginia, kind of a feudalistic system, or she compared it to Tsarist Russia, where you had the peasants and in the mine guards or Cossacks and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, there have been a lot of those types of comparisons, but it certainly was not the way the system was supposed to work. And I think another thing, David, that I would add to all that is what heightened the tensions even more was World War One. A lot of miners were exempt from the draft, and because coal production was so important,
I did not
coal,
know that.
yeah, you didn't have to go if you were a coal miner because coal production was considered so important. The Union, in fact, made a no strike pledge during World War One that they would put aside grievances and dig all the coal they could for the war effort. And if you're familiar with the World War One war effort, Wilson's slogan "Make the world safe for democracy." But having said all of that, and I should mention that the miners in West Virginia in the early part of the 20th century were suffering a higher death ratio than the American Expeditionary Force in World War One. So yeah, over 100,000 miners have died in coal mining accidents in American history, which is more than quite a few of our wars combined. But anyway, nonetheless, a lot of miners went and fought anyway. You even had some miners on record, even as recently as World War II miners, who said they felt they had a better chance in the military surviving that than staying in a West Virginia mine. So, with all of that, a number of miners joined the military and went overseas. And it could be as many as 20% to 25%, maybe even more, of miners that participated in the Battle of Blair Mountain were veterans of World War One. And the reason that's significant is because they went overseas to fight this war to make the world safe for democracy, and they come back home and they see where I grew up. There's democracy isn't here. We went overseas to fight this war and we come back and we don't have our freedom right here. And that's one of the things that just heightened this rebellious attitude. And one other thing, if I'm going to, since I'm on a roll with World War One, um, it's that's also, of course, why the miners threw down their guns whenever federal troops arrived. They would not fight federal troops
Okay.
because many of them were veterans, and their beef wasn't with the U.S. government. Their beef was with the mine guard system. Their beef was with the West Virginia government. And so, even though they were having this rebellion, it wasn't to overturn the United States. It wasn't an anti-American thing. Frank Keeney said that the Battle of Blair Mountain was about reestablishing the Bill of Rights, and um, so that kind of summed it up. It wasn't, as some people would call, like a near communist revolution or something like that going on. Although it has to be understood, Blair Mountain, in context of all these huge uprisings that were taking place right after World War I across Western civilization. Of course, the Russian Revolution, but also there were revolutions in Germany called the Spartacus Uprising that killed about 2,000 people. You had huge labor uprisings in Italy. Labor uprisings in Vienna were one of the things that helped crumble military resistance in the Austrian army. They had hundreds of thousands of workers went on strike early in 1918, and that's one of the things that helped crumble the war effort in the Austrian Empire. And they had the Irish Revolution of 1916. So this was happening. These kinds of things were happening all over the place after World War One, in part because all of this blood had been shed, and some people were thinking, well, the world's supposed to be safe for democracy. Where is it?
Well, and it's true because we look at all the union uprisings all over the world at that time, and they're all for different reasons within their own societal like context.
Right.
And I think that the American union movement is so uniquely American versus what happened in Europe or what happened in Russia. The American Union movement it was really basically again fighting for their independence. It was almost like a reboot of the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, when the miners were in groups, the little groups that they would form to fight in the woods, they referred to themselves as Minutemen, which is, of course, what the guys outside of Lexington and Concord referred to themselves as. So there's an obvious correlation. I think like Paint Creek and Cabin Creek were to them their Lexington and Concord in many ways.
And is it fair to say that the union movement in West Virginia, and arguably, I think that's probably the most important union movement in the country, it really is kind of like it is the backbone of the American Union philosophy almost. This idea that I'm going to defend my family, I'm going to defend my neighbors. What amazed me about your book, and I did not know this, and I'm embarrassed to say I didn't know it, was that the coal miners in 1921, they were desegregationists. They were desegregating these towns during this massive basically strike walk right towards Blair Mountain. I mean, this was something that was kind of unheard of at the time, and they were pushing this. I mean, this is amazing to me that they were so isolated and so advanced, and yet most Americans look at them as being so backwards.
Right. Yeah, they were ahead of their time in that regard. And they didn't have any choice but to be that way because these coal towns, it was the coal operators had a word for it. They called it judicious mixture. Justice Collins was one of the most prominent coal operators of the time, and he referred to this policy as judicious mixture. What they would do, these coal camps, if you've ever been to West Virginia, the hills aren't incredibly tall. Okay, these aren't tall mountains, some of them 2,000, 3,000 feet, but these aren't huge mountains, but they're really steep. And where people don't live on the mountains. People actually live in the little cracks in between the mountains because these settlements can basically just follow creeks and rivers, the little flat area around them. So they kind of snake along rivers and creeks. So they're all compressed together. So these coal towns, the African Americans, the immigrants, and the native whites are all right there together. Yes, there's like a little black section and an immigrant section and a white section in the coal town, but those sections are really just these four houses, and then the next four houses are immigrant, and then the next four houses, well, I mean, they're right beside each other. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
They're not separated by any fencing or anything like that. They're all working together. They're all making the same wages. Coal mining was the only occupation in the United States at the time that a black man could make the same amount of money as a white man because they were paid the same. And so
Mm-hmm.
the union, if they're going to be successful, they have to organize all these groups. The coal industry thought that if we take these different groups and we mix them all together, then they'll just fight one another and then they won't unify. But that's actually not what happened. The exact opposite happened. They did unify, and I think one of the biggest problems in our country today are differences and alleged or believed differences in these same different groups: rural white people, working class poor white people, immigrants, and African Americans. that these groups are often at odds with one another, or there's fear, fear of immigration, or all this kinds of things. And it's amazing to see um, a different situation in the coal fields 100 years ago. And I want to overstress, it's not as though this was some kind of labor utopia or racial ethnic utopia where they're all holding hands singing kumbaya around the campfire. Okay.
Hmm.
Obviously, they still had their prejudices, but they also understood the only way we stand any chance is if we overlook those differences and set those things aside. And so that's what created this type of camaraderie within these groups, which was very unique for the time.
It's kind of, in a sense, the exact opposite of identity politics that we find today. I mean, these guys were, and it wasn't that they chose this; they were forced into it by the employers. But it was really the forced melding, if you will, of different people.
Right, right. The only hope they've got is working together. And when you're down in the mine, you have to also depend on one another. It's an incredibly dangerous job. And so people have to work together in order to survive in those conditions. And when you work with people, I think that's when you grow closer to people. When you're working together on something, and you begin to see that as opposed to your differences.
So, why don't you tell me a little bit about the actual coal mining process, or at least what it was during the days of this battle?
Yeah. Okay. So when you're talking about the job of mining 100 years ago, it's first of all something that I'm glad that I don't have to do. It's you have to use your own equipment. It's by hand. They had a type of huge drill. We have an example of one of these at the Mine Wars Museum called a breast auger, which is this huge drill that you use by hand, and you drill. So you go to your coal seam. Everybody had their own little section that they worked in. They might have an assistant, but if you were, been a coal miner for a few years, you would have your little section where you would work, and you would go down there, of course. Take your little canary in your coal cage, which is that's something that's used a lot. People always talk about the canary in the coal mine, but of course that was there because they were really sensitive to methane and other gases, and so if the canary falls over, it's time to run. So there were always gases that you were unleashing that could be ignited with a spark, that could cause explosions. And the cave-ins were a big, big issue. A lot more miners died from cave-ins, just wooden beams breaking and the roof collapsing on them. That was the more regular cause of death as opposed to explosions. But there were huge explosions, like the Monongah blast of 1907, that killed at least 361 people. Uh, in The last big mining disaster was the Upper Big Branch disaster in 2010, which killed 29. But you go back 100 years, that was regular occurrence. In the 1920s, there were around 400 miners a year that were being killed in West Virginia alone. Just mine blasts all the time. But anyway, you had your own little section. So you would take your breast auger and you find your coal seam or your rock seam, and you drill a hole. Then you pack it full of dynamite, and then you light the fuse and then run around the corner, and it blows up. And then you just shovel it into the cart. You would keep track. Each miner would keep track of what they mined because they were not paid by the hour; they were paid by the ton. And so they would load it up, and then they would put each miner had their own little type of check tag with a number on it representing this was their mine, and they would have a mule draw it up towards the opening of the mine, where it would then go to the tipple and be weighed. Um, Coal miners often complained that the weights were fixed by coal operators. In fact, in the Paint Creek Cabin Creek strike, one of their biggest demands was that the miners be able to hire their own guy to watch the weights so that they couldn't be fixed. They called it a check weighman. It should be noted in the Paint Creek Cabin Creek strike, the first big strike of the mine wars, the miners never asked for a raise. They didn't ask for more money. They just asked for, they had a number of other demands. But getting back to the job itself, this is back-breaking work. By the way, in the late 1800s, in some coal towns, before cocaine was made illegal, they actually sold leaf cocaine, not the modern powdery form, but they actually sold leaf cocaine in some company stores. And miners would buy the leaves, and pack up their pipes full of cocaine so that they could dig more coal during their shifts. So this was, backbreaking, dangerous work, and of course, miners that had worked for 20 years or plus, their bodies are permanently affected by it. Injuries that they sustain. Almost every coal miner I've ever met has a variety of injuries. In modern times, that has led to more things like black lung. Black lung, by the way, is something that really picked up after World War II because the machines began to replace people, and they begin to have these mechanized ways of cutting into the coal seams, and the machines just kick up so much more dust than the original pick and dynamite, and so miners are breathing in a lot more dust. So in the 50s and 60s, you begin to see tons and tons of miners die of black lung. And that statistic I gave you a little bit ago, about 100,000 miners dying in the mines, that does not count black lung statistics, which are very hard to find. Tens of thousands of miners have died from black lung complications, but they have to prove it that they have black lung, and coal companies have a lot of ways of fighting that in court. And so we'll never know the exact statistics on that.
Wait a minute. You mean the 100,000 miners dead does not include what we assume is the major killer of miners is black lung?
Right,
That is wow, I had
right.
no
That's
idea.
correct.
So that's insane.
Yeah, yeah, it is. And obviously, black lung is this horrible disease. I've seen people that suffer from it. It just, it's a respiratory disease, and we know all about respiratory diseases right now due to the pandemic, and you can just see what it does to people, and it drives families bankrupt in the coal fields today. And one more thing about the physicality of the work. As unionism began to decline in the 1980s in this region and into the 1990s, more and more coal miners had to work in non-union mines, and as a result they would get injured on the mines. If they're a union mine and you get injured, you can take off until you get better and get your job back. In a non-union mine, if you get injured and can't you do your job, you lose your job. And so a lot of miners would continue to work injured, and what the companies would do is they would send miners to doctors where they could get pills, pain pills. And so a lot of miners got hooked on pain pills in the 90s as a result of trying to continue to work injured in the mines. And that's one of the things that contributed to the huge opioid crisis in the region.
So what you're saying though is that the decrease in unionization at the national level has actually increased or has contributed to this opioid crisis because there's no protection for the workers when they get hurt. They just got to keep just going for it.
Correct. That's
So
correct.
we talking about unionization a little bit. The union system that we as Americans think about. We a lot of Americans think about unions, and some think good things and others think not so good things. 52% of the United States roughly think the unions are good. The rest of them don't think unions are good. It's a pretty black and white statistic actually,
Yeah,
but
that's pretty close, 52 to 48%.
yeah, it's a scary number. But it's what really is interesting is if when you look at when you look at the reasons why people don't like unions, they think they're corrupt. They think that they're actually anti-worker. They think that they're just a bunch of rich fat cats trying to take advantage of the working man.
Right.
What what is I mean what would you say is the biggest factor with the decrease in unionization in West Virginia? Is it just that the unions aren't doing the job, or is it that there's just no support coming from the outside, or what? Why do you think unions are decreasing in popularity, at least in West Virginia and the region?
Okay, let's talk about first the UMWA and its decline. There's a few reasons for that. One of the reasons I've already touched on is mine mechanization. Uh, Mine mechanization led to a huge decrease in numbers of coal miners. You had 100,000 coal miners working in West Virginia in 1946, right after World War II. By the 1960s, that number is cut in half to under 50,000 due to mine mechanization, machines replacing people, which is, of course, a big issue today. Machines replacing people. And By the time you get into the 1980s, that number was cut in half again. So, first of all, the union has fewer numbers by the time we get into the 80s. So that's one thing. There was problems. You mentioned corruption. There were problems with union corruption in the national, the international UMWA. Uh, by in the 1960s and early 70s, you had the whole Tony Boyle situation where he was kind of ruling the union with an iron hand and was corrupt and was taking money from co-operators, and uh, he had his rival killed, and all this huge scandal within the union. So there were problems with union corruption and people kind of being disenchanted with the union because of that. Now they did reform within the union in the 70s and 80s, but the damage had been done. And then there was also a change in union tactics in the 1980s. They adopted a thing called selective striking. What that meant was that a union local could do their own strike just in their own little area, and it wouldn't be a national strike, as opposed to what it used to be when the union would go on strike. They'd all go on strike. Well, this was selective striking. It was under Richard Trumka, actually, who's now president of the AFL-CIO, and they started this selective striking thing. And that one of the things that did is union miners in West Virginia sometimes took advantage of that. I've mentioned this in my book, and I grew up with it, so I saw it. There was always wildcat strikes deer hunting season. um, and so there's a 2-week period in West Virginia where you can hunt deer with a gun. Only 2 weeks. The rest of the season you can hunt with a bow and arrow. But everybody always wants gun season because it's obviously much easier to kill a deer with a gun than a bow and arrow. And so miners would walk out of the job at the beginning of gun season, with a bunch of ridiculous, reasons that weren't even real reasons, and then they would come back whenever deer hunting season was over. It got to such an extent that some co-operators just started shutting down their mines during deer hunting season. But that obviously, while it's kind of funny, the on the other level, that doesn't give the union a good reputation.
Mm-hmm.
And there's been old union miners have said, we shot ourselves in the foot by doing things like that. And because if you strike for frivolous reasons or walk out on the job for frivolous reasons, and then the real issues come, they're not going to take you as seriously. And that's something that happens in the mid 1980s when Don Blankenship, kind of the last of these kind of old school coal barons, rises up into Massey Energy and started a really effective union busting movement in which Massey would buy out union mines and then shut them down and reopen them about 6 months later as a non-union mine. And this led to a number of significant strikes in the 1980s between the UMWA and Massey Energy. And Massey Energy came out on top in those strikes. They got the local political apparatus and the state police behind them, and they were able to deunionize many of the coal fields. So you have this combination of factors: mechanization, you had some union corruption, you had some frivolous wildcat strikes, and in addition, you have a co-operator that became incredibly influential in the region that took advantage of all that.
So you basically had coal miners starving out the population until they gave up their card. Very very similar to what happens with the right to work situation, where employers start just going non-union. The unions basically starve and they shut down. So that's kind of what was happening at the micro scale in West Virginia.
Right. Yeah.
This is one of the reasons why I think Trump won West Virginia, because he said, I'm going to bring it back. I'm going to take care of you. And it was, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's just when they had a really rough time under the Obama administration.
Yeah, they did. The real shift, the election that really changed things in West Virginia goes back to 2000. We can talk about Trump here very shortly. I'll get to him. But 2000, West Virginia had voted Democrat in every presidential election since the New Deal, since FDR, except one. I think they voted for Reagan once. But I'm pretty sure I think they went for Carter over Reagan the first time, and I think they went for Reagan the second time. But anyway, um, they went Republic or they went Democrat in every presidential election except one for a period of 68 years. Um, so it was a strong Democrat state. I can get into those reasons later on. But anyway, what happened in 2000? By 2000, first of all, Democrats had taken West Virginia for granted. They just assumed that West Virginia was going to go blue. Al Gore pretty much ignored the state. And Al Gore, of course, was the first presidential candidate to really talk about climate change, really talk about renewable energy. And the coal industry latched on to that. And they put forth this pretty strong and effective campaign in West Virginia that if Al Gore wins, this is the future of the Democratic Party. They're going environmental, and if they win, then they're going to put the industry out. And in addition to there's a lot of other propaganda in the region about climate change being a hoax and all this kind of stuff. So that was effective, and it was incredibly significant because West Virginia's 5 points swung the election. Everybody, of course, talks about Florida and the 100 votes in the 2000 election that gave Florida to Bush, but Bush doesn't win without West Virginia. It was that close in the Electoral College, and West Virginia turning red, that played a role in changing American history in that sense. And West Virginia has been red ever since. And all 55 counties in the last two presidential elections have gone full Republican. Part of that is, of course, this notion of saving the coal industry. There are other reasons as well, cultural reasons. Second Amendment is a big issue, obviously, around here. And of course, there are a lot of Protestant Christians around here that are strongly pro life. So those issues come into play. But when you look at the situation with coal mining and even natural gas drilling, which has really had an uptick in West Virginia. Natural gas employs about the same amount of people as coal does now in West Virginia. So, obviously, with the Democrats, they're going to move away from that, and Republicans are going to say we're going to keep it. And Trump coming here in 2016, and he came here a lot in 2000. He gave a lot of attention to West Virginia. Came to Charleston, did a big rally, put a big coal miner's helmet on his head, and gave it the big thumbs up. And he was big buddies with the governor of West Virginia, Jim Justice. And so that explains a good bit of the enthusiasm. Trump also said certain things that could resonate with West Virginians. If you remember me recalling when coal miners had their ballots filled out for them,
Mm-hmm.
and there's a lot of local election corruption that historically in the coal fields. And so, what was one of Trump's big rallying cries? It's a rigged system, right? It's rigged. It's all rigged. So things like that resonated with people in West Virginia that had a history of things being rigged. And so that made sense. That's why, Trump would say a number of outlandish things, but then he'd say, well, the system's rigged. And I would hear somebody, a fellow West Virginian say, well, he tells it like it is. Even though, sometimes he would say some of the most outlandish, crazy stuff in the world.
Right.
And then you'd wonder, how on earth are you getting that he tells it like it is? But him saying, oh, it's a rigged system, if for a West Virginian, something like that resonates. Because in this state, it has been rigged. And that explains a good bit of it.
It's so crazy because there's so much of a cultural similarity between West Virginia and a lot of the Midwest towns, and where I'm from, Minnesota, is very similar.
Right.
And I think that there's definitely a disconnect. I would almost say that West Virginia is almost like Middle America, really.
Mhm.
It has a lot more to do with Middle America than where it's at. There's not big industry in West Virginia. There's not big industry in Minnesota. There's not big industry in Indiana. There's not a big industry in Wyoming or North or South Dakota. I mean, I don't hear a lot of discussion about how to get these workers out of the mix and how to get these workers retrained. I mean, in West Virginia, is there a push for that? Is there I mean, has anyone been pushing that aside from just the local communities or the workers themselves? I mean, is there any political will to retrain these workers, or are we heading toward just another massive unemployment?
Yeah, here's the problem. Uh, is you have it's very difficult to get elected in West Virginia if you say anything negative about the coal industry. It's first of all they fund a lot of politicians, and it's very difficult to get campaign money. And you know as well as I do, running campaigns, even local campaigns, takes a lot of money these days, and it's very difficult to get any kind of funding if you're anti-coal in any way, shape, or form. I was in a film a couple of years ago called From the Ashes. It was on National Geographic Channel about the decline of the coal industry. And through that, I had ended up getting hooked up with it was Bloomberg that funded the film. And through that, I'd ended up getting hooked up with Bloomberg Philanthropies. And I was in talks with them. I was with the small college where I was teaching. I said, "Hey, you guys are talking about clean energy, and Bloomberg's supposed to be this big, you know, alternative energy guy." And I was like, "Why don't you then donate some money to this college so that they can start up, a solar panel project or whatever?" And they didn't offer me any promises or anything, but they said they would be willing to do a call with administration in my college. And so I took it to my administration and said, "Hey, there's a potential that Bloomberg Philanthropies might be interested in helping to fund some kind of renewable energy program here." They wouldn't even take the call. Um,
Wow.
because to do that in a place like Logan County, that means them admitting that coal doesn't have a future.
Hmm.
And admitting that publicly is political suicide. So even though there's a lot of very realistic politicians that understand these changes are taking place, you'll never hear it in their public rhetoric because for fear of losing elections, and even like I said, the local county structures. Um, it's this kind of entrenched good old boy system. If you speak out, in the wrong way, they're going to shut you up pretty quickly. So it's very, very difficult to get local leadership to even admit that the ship is sinking. That's one of the huge obstacles and frustrating things that I see happening.
Well, then let's back it up. Let's go back to August and September of 1921. What caused this entire thing to happen? I mean, the actual battle. And again, it's like I can't stress this enough to anyone listening. This was a battle. This was a full-on fight. There were aircraft dropping bombs on strikers. I mean, there was a I don't I can't really I mean there are headlines that say Air Fleet ordered to West Virginia battlefield,
Right.
in the Washington Times. It's just what led up to this, and if you can just give us an idea of like the political environment that led up to this, and really what was the deal?
Okay. So it's after World War One. You have three counties in the southernmost region of the state that have yet to be unionized. Throughout World War One, the union had been very successful. My great grandfather had become president of the union in West Virginia. He was also president of the State Federation of Labor, by the way. Uh, and so they had this enormously successful unionizing drive. They'd organized all the counties in West Virginia, with the exception of three: Logan, Mingo, and McDowell. And these were the three top coal producing counties, though. And these were the places where anti-unionism was the very strongest. They make a beachhead in Mingo County. They found there was a local chief of police there by the name of Sid Hatfield that was welcoming to the union. They were able to sneak organizers into the area. They start making progress, but Mingo County becomes the ground zero for all this violence that would take place. Thousands of miners get evicted. They go out into tent colonies. You have the Make One massacre that killed 10 people. And then in the summer 1921, the biggest event, the 3 days Battle of the Tug, like I mentioned earlier, which was 3 days of guerrilla warfare fighting that stretched for about 3 to 5 miles of territory on both the Kentucky and West Virginia side of the Tug River. For those unfamiliar with the geography, the little Tug River separate is for part of its way is the West Virginia Kentucky border. And so you had miners on the hillsides on both sides of the river firing at state police, which had just been created. The West Virginia State Police was created specifically to put down these strikes after World War One. And so you had these gunfights going on. After the 3 days battle, martial law gets declared. Things really escalate throughout the course of the summer. This is only a couple of months before Blair Mountain, right? So they declare martial law. They bring in National Guard, bring in a bunch of troops. But once they do that, they arrest all kinds of miners, mostly for no reason without habeas corpus, of course, it's martial law, and begin imprisoning a bunch of them. A few hundred of them were basically just suddenly thrown into prison and just kept under lock and key, awaiting military tribunal. Meanwhile, the state police and others attacked the tent colonies, ripped up a lot of the tents, um, and they stole the food. And they began blocking shipments of food that were coming from the UMWA to the tent colonies. So, with all of that, there's these rising tension in all the other counties and in the Union leadership because now they can't get food to these tent colonies. You have all these miners that are arrested and under martial law. And then on August the 1st, Sid Hatfield, that had played this key role in the Battle of Matewan and was kind of a folk hero to the miners at this point because he was a local sheriff or a local policeman that stood up for them as opposed to being bought out by the industry. He and his deputy, Ed Chambers, were murdered on the McDowell County Courthouse steps by mine guards. The whole town saw it. Nobody went to jail over it. And after that, it was a week after that, on August the 7th, 1921, that about 5,000 miners converged around the state capitol in West Virginia, like the Capitol building. We recently, obviously, just had a situation with the national capitol, right? Uh, they didn't storm the Capitol, but you have around 5,000 miners, many of them armed, that are surrounding the Capitol. Mother Jones is there. My great grandfather is there. They have a list of demands about what to do in Mingo County. They come to the governor's office with their list of the demand. The governor won't even let them in, won't let them talk. Keeney goes out to the crowd and said that the governor won't even see them. They won't even talk to them. The government has abandoned them. And he said the only way you can get your rights is with a high-powered rifle. And he told the miners to go home and await the call to march. And about 2 weeks later, miners began assembling at Marmet, which is a little town just south of Charleston. And their intention eventually, somewhere in the neighborhood of 10,000 is the standard number used, but we really don't know the exact numbers. It's probably somewhere between 10 and 20,000. It starts out at around 6,000 and then it just grows. Miners from all over the state join, and their goal is to get through. Logan County is in between Charleston and Mingo County geographically. So they're going to have to go through Logan County to get to Mingo County. And the idea was to free the miners that were in prison with martial law, bring food and supplies to the people in the tent colonies, basically end the mine guard system by force. But in order for them to get to Mingo County, they have to go through Logan, and there's a series of mountain ridges just north of Logan town, and Blair Mountain is crucial among these mountain ridges. There's about 12 miles of mountain ridges, and that's where Don Chafin and the co-operators set up defensive entrenchments along these mountain ridges. And in order to get through to Mingo, the miners were going to have to get through Blair Mountain. And so it was highly organized. They had been planning this potentially for up to 2 years, going back to 1919. I could talk a long time about that, but I'll try to be brief here. Um, they basically they were divided into units. They usually had World War I veterans in charge of each little platoon that they had. They were supplied with guns. They had a couple Gatling guns that they were able to secure. They had dynamite. They brought nurses. Some of the women served as nurses. They set up little field hospitals. And when they got north of Blair, they divided up and basically tried to do some kind of enveloping pincer movement by attacking both flanks of the defensive entrenchments. It was very similar, in fact, to the second day of fighting at the Battle of Gettysburg, where you had this in that instance you had Confederate forces down below and Union forces were on the hills, and Lee tried to do attacks on both flanks to try to roll back the armies. That's basically the lay of the land at Blair Mountain. The miners attacked the flanks, which first of all that shows high organization. It also shows they knew where the defensive entrenchments would be. You don't know where your enemy is and where they're dug in unless you've done some reconnaissance. You have to be organized to know all this stuff. And anyway, they come close to breaking the lines on a place called Crooked Creek Gap in the north, but ultimately they're fought back. But they probably would have broken through had it not been for federal troops arriving on the fifth day of fighting. And when federal troops arrived, that's when miners laid down their arms. But the miners were never fully able to break through because if you've ever been there, as I have, and you look these incredibly steep ridge lines, way steeper, by the way, than the Battle of Gettysburg, really steep hillsides. And I've been on these entrenchments where they had machine guns placed. And if you've got a machine gun and you've got this little trench and you're looking down on these huge steep ravines, it's easy to see how they would be able to hold the line against much greater numbers. There were probably about 2,000 plus defenders and well over 10,000 attackers. But if you're up in these entrenched positions with machine guns, you can hold back much larger numbers, which what they were effectively able to do. And of course, the miners weren't trained soldiers, so they're not just going to do a full on charge like you would do if you were regular military. And so after 4 days of fighting, and of course the the United States Air Service was brought in under Billy Mitchell, and they were going to potentially drop bombs, but the bombs that were dropped were actually planes that were owned by Don Chafin, um, who rented out these planes, and so it was the companies that were actually dropping the bombs. The federal planes actually didn't drop any bombs, although they were prepared to do so. They actually got hit by a storm, and a couple of the planes crashed in the storm, and they were never actually able to partake in what was going on. Billy Mitchell was really disappointed about that. He was one of the big early advocates of creating a United States Air Force, and he wanted to show how planes could be used to quell domestic uprisings. And so he was really eager to bring the Air Service into that as a way of showing how the Air Force would be the future. But he didn't get that opportunity.
So this was not a strike. This is not a strike that most people understand as a strike. This is just a full on war, and this was the culmination of the entire mine wars, right?
Right. Right. It's full on war with armies, with provisions, with strategies. Yeah, I mean it's as much of a battle as you can be. Kenny King, the local from Logan County that began the first explorations of Blair Mountain, he has hundreds upon hundreds, maybe over 1,000 bullet shell casings that he's found from the battlefield. Um, I have a couple of the bullets myself. Guns that he's found. It's extraordinary the how much fighting was taking place over there, and you can see one of the amazing things about the battlefield itself. If you sneak up there, you can't just walk up there because it's coal company property. But they're if they aren't looking, you can get up there. Not that I would do something like that, but if you're up there, you can see by the layout of the bullets that you find, you can see okay, there was a miner standing behind this tree with a 30-06, and he fired 14 rounds, and then apparently he moved to this tree over here. You could literally see and map out this tree to tree fighting that was taking place on the hillsides. Just pretty extraordinary stuff.
What was the scale? I mean, how big was this battlefield? I mean, it's I'm just trying to paint the mental image of what this was.
It was about a 12-mile front.
12,
Um,
12 miles.
yeah, about a 12-mile front. It's called the Battle of Blair Mountain, but the battle itself was much bigger than the actual Blair Mountain. The Blair Mountain is actually at the southern end of the fighting, and the fighting extended on up through what's called Spruce Fork Ridge, all the way up to a place called Mill Creek. So Blair Mountain was actually just one little section of where the fighting was called, even though it's called the Battle of Blair Mountain. Blair Mountain's not 12 miles long. It's so it extended for quite a long. But to give you a comparison, the World War One Battle of Verdun began on an 8-mile front. Okay, now Verdun would get bigger, but you can see that we're talking about a World War One scale size battlefield.
All right, so battle happens and it ends. The miners basically give up to the U.S. military. So really, the miners didn't win. I mean, the miners lost, right?
Yeah, yeah. There's sometimes local contention over this point. There are some people. Something that I've dealt with since the mine wars have become a much more part of the regional discourse in the last decade due to our preservation efforts. Sometimes you get people that I deal with this on the with folks on the left who want to kind of romanticize it, and kind of turn it into this shining moment of victory for labor when it really wasn't. It wasn't that at all. No, they didn't. They didn't break the lines. They didn't get through Domingo. They didn't reach their objectives. And this battle was followed by 3 years of intense litigation, the treason trials, which would take place, which bankrupted the Union. Over 500 individuals were charged with treason, murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and these trials dragged out until 1924, and it bankrupted the Union in West Virginia. The coal operators obviously didn't have to worry about it because that wasn't going to bankrupt them. They could afford the legal fees, but the union couldn't. And they also couldn't do that and continue with their strike efforts that were going on in Mingo County. So the Mingo strike failed. The union president of the National, John L. Lewis, was privately infuriated with my great grandfather and Fred Mooney, one of the other union leaders, for organizing this whole thing, which he felt was they were too radical, and he also kind of feared that they were too popular with the rank and file and thought they might be a threat to him. So 2 weeks after the treason trials are over, Keeney and Mooney are forced to resign from the union. And when they left the union, there were 50,000 union miners in West Virginia. 5 years later, when the stock market crash happens, there's less than 1,000. This led to complete deunionization of the coal fields. Now, you saw coal production soar to its highest point in West Virginia in the 20s, but you also saw the highest number of coal mining deaths in the 1920s that coincided with that. And obviously, unionism took a big hit until you get to the New Deal in 1933.
We know what happened with the battle. The New Deal came in. Unions kind of come back a little bit, but they obviously don't come back to their former glory before they were actually technically legal. Now we're kind of where you come into the picture. What was happening? Why would you get into this?
Okay, so it obviously was put briefly on the National Register of Historic Places. This was an effort that a local mountaineer by the name of Kenny King had started. His grandfather had fought in the battle. And just in the 90s, he just thought, well, I wonder if there's anything up there. So he just took a metal detector and started, heading up onto the mountains. And he started just finding all kinds of stuff, as I've already mentioned. And he spent several years trying to get it put on the National Register, and he was able to finally get some professional help from Harvard Ayers, an archaeologist out of Appalachian State University, and Barbara Rasmussen, a historian at West Virginia University. They were able to prepare a nomination. It was put on the National Register. However, the coal industry was able to get it delisted from the National Register very shortly, within a few months of it being listed. Now, it's a complicated process how they got it delisted, but they used some fraudulent means that was later overturned in court. But it took 9 years for it to be overturned in court. In the meantime, the reason they wanted it off the National Register is they had surface mining permits across the Blair Mountain battlefield. They were going to use mountaintop removal to destroy the battlefield. And if you're unfamiliar with mountaintop removal, this is coal mining on a gargantuan scale. They have it blasts the entire tops of mountains. You really can't get a good view or a good perspective on the extent of mountaintop removal until you see southern West Virginia from the air. If you're ever flying over it, you can't really see it very well from ground level. You get up on the air, and the entire southern part of the state has these big swaths of area where it's just bare patches where mountains used to be. And some of these mountaintop removal sites are enormous, encompassing more than 4,000 acres in territory. In fact, about 330,000 acres have been mountaintop removed in West Virginia. That's enough to put a couple of Disney Worlds in West Virginia on the acreage. And when I say Disney World, I'm not talking about the theme park. I'm talking about all of Disney World in Florida, with Epcot and Animal Kingdom and all that other stuff thrown in the mix. But anyway, obviously, if you blast it, all the archaeological evidence would be gone. There's never been a full archaeological survey of the entire battlefield. Even Keeney, in all of his years going up there, it's real rugged territory. He's only been able to survey about 25% of the battlefield. And he's not a professional archaeologist. And we've got Harvard Ayers, and then later on a guy by the name of Brandon Knight, another archaeologist that have done a little bit of work up there. But they've only done like a work on maybe 8 acres, 10 acres, these little sections. It's never been fully studied. They blast it, everything's gone. All of those archaeological treasures, and the place would be gone. You can't rebuild a battlefield. They have this thing called reclamation in the mining industry, where they say they're going to put back the mountain, which isn't true. They basically just plant a few trees and move on. But imagine you blowing up Little Round Top at Gettysburg. Imagine. Right. Blowing up parts of Shiloh or Yorktown or any of these important battlefields in American history, or Little Bighorn. The list goes on. So I just couldn't imagine that they would try to completely wipe out this history. And I've mentioned to you the ridge lines and the entrenchments. You really don't get a feel for the scale and the seriousness of the battle unless you can actually sit down and look at it, as you can walk up those slopes and see it and experience it. Being in the place really broadens your understanding of a historical event. So I see battlefields as sacred ground in that respect. And I didn't think the industry had a right to touch it. And in my research, I had already discovered how the industry and politicians had suppressed the history in the region, how they'd taken it out of books. And that's not an assumption. There's a paper trail for that. The governors literally manipulated books, textbooks, and history books and books written about West Virginia to omit this. And now they're trying to blast away the spot where it happened. And I just found that to be totally unacceptable. And again, the big issue, one of our biggest obstacles in doing this, I knew in making the stand against this, I would be labeled an environmental activist in the region. And that's basically like being called a witch in Salem. To be called an environmental activist in West Virginia, that's like, that's a stigma, to put it mildly. And I had to work around that. I had to in our organization, Friends of Blair, we had to, at first, we needed the help of the environmental community to do this big protest march we organized, in which we retraced the steps of the miners as they did in 1921. We took the exact route that they took to Blair Mountain over the course of a week. And that in and of itself is a big old story. But ultimately, we kind of distance ourselves from the environmental movement and just talk about the history. Because if you told people stop mountaintop removal at Blair Mountain, they would go, "What are you crazy? What are you, some kind of tree hugger?" But if I said we have to preserve this battlefield, they would say, "Oh, okay."
Mm-hmm.
So if we found very quickly, if you emphasize the history, emphasize the significance of what happened, and don't talk about the environmental aspect of it, then people were like, "Oh yes, absolutely, we've got to preserve this, we've got to save this." But if you say no mountaintop removal, save the trees, then you're going to get an entirely different reaction. And so we had to walk that fine tightrope in order to win over public support, which we eventually did, but it was tough going for a while.
So we got the battlefield, and you finally get it recognized as a battlefield. Going against up against coal, you're going up against law enforcement, you're going up against politicians. As you just said, you're going up against just people in general, just fighting you every which way. You're fighting it from the historical standpoint. You're getting lumped in with the environmental movement, and you're trying to stop something from happening that's incredibly uh, I guess would be advantageous to the community, correct? Because it's jobs, it's money, it's people making a living. You're doing this during a time when coal mining's really, the national eye on coal mining is not quite as favorable as it used to be, and so people are taking, they're very aggressive and very defensive of coal, as you've pointed out. I mean, how do you get it done?
Well, a few things. First of all, we were able to approach it from a little different angle than other activist groups. As I write about in my book, I had no experience with activism before this. None. I'd never been to a protest. I was just content to be, a history professor and write books that were academic that no one would ever read, and just kind of go on about my life. I was kind of apolitical, so I came into this with some fresh eyes, though. And what I found very quickly is we had to find ways to attack the situation that ordinary activist groups wouldn't do. For example, a lot of environmental groups chose civil disobedience as a means of trying to stop the industry. They would do things called tree sits, where they would, chain themselves to a tree or go up in a tree stand to stop production on a surface mine site. Or they would go to West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection headquarters in Charleston and chain themselves to the door because DEP wasn't enforcing environmental rules. Things like this. These had been very common in the 3 or 4 years leading up to the big Blair Mountain protest march. We moved away from that tactic. I didn't think it just simply wasn't successful. This type of civil disobedience had not been effective in ending mining permits or suspending. They could suspend work for a few days. That just meant that the companies docked the workers' pay. And now the workers are even more angry at the protesters, and the company didn't really lose that much. And we wanted to get away from that. That wasn't going to be effective. So how were we going to be effective? Well, I knew from my study of history and because of my focus on this region that the coal industry breaks the law all the time. They just do. And I think that's the case with almost any big industry. They cut corners, is what I mean, is with regulations and all this. And a lot of times, these little regulations that they break aren't heavily enforced because the head of the state Department of Environmental Protection is appointed by the governor, and oftentimes it's a coal operator. The last 4 years, a coal operator has been the head of the Department of Environmental Protection in West Virginia. That makes sense, right? So we knew that there are going to be regulations and things that they've skipped over. We knew that if we could find those things, so I kind of took my academic skills, and we said we're going to use Freedom of Information Act, and we're going to get all the paper information on all of these permits, on what they've done. We're going to get all the reports of inspections, and I bet we're going to find something that they did illegal, because that's what they do. We just knew it. And we did. We found that there were agreements that they weren't supposed to do surface disturbances on the battlefield, as long as there's an issue about Blair Mountain on the National Register. All these promises that they had made to the State Historic Preservation Office and all these things that they had made. And we found them. We found a paper trail of them, and we'd found places where they'd broken the law. And so then we could set up meetings with guys like West Virginia DEP and the Division of Forestry and these other um, agencies. And instead of protesting, we could sit down across them and then pull out the paper trail and say, is this your signature on this letter? Is this letter? You all aren't doing this. And if you all don't rectify it, we can now go before the West Virginia Surface Mine Board or go before the courts and show where you're not doing your job. And if you then learn the law, learn the details, learn, the devil's in the details, but sometimes you can use the details to give them the devil. And that's kind of what we did. And instead of protesting, or standing out there with a sign or chaining myself to a tree, instead I'm going to dig into the details, find out where you are cutting corners, and then become a pebble in your shoe. Then now you're going to have to pay with litigation. Now we're going to hold these agencies accountable. And with that, we were able to stop them on one of their main permits, the Camp Branch permit, which is one of the three big surface mining permits in the battlefield, and basically stall them from making any progress until federal litigation turned in our favor, and we won the National Register court case, which brought it back. The significance about the National Register is you can't, in West Virginia, you can't surface mine a site that's on the National Register of Historic Places. And so that's why they wanted it off so bad. So it was in finding this different kind of approach. I talk about this in the book about how a lot of activist groups kind of romanticize the idea of protests and civil disobedience, and protests can have their place. They can be very effective, but that wasn't going to be effective here in the coal fields, because if I were to do something like that, immediately everybody's going to say, well, that's just another hippie environmentalist, and then they would just ignore everything else that came out of my mouth. So if we would change this and talk about the history, meet with these agencies, try to find alternative solutions, come at them with this different angle. First of all, they're not going to be expecting it. And number two, they're not going to be able to dismiss me by saying I'm just some kind of hippie out there to, do a drum circle on top of Blair Mountain.
So you got it. So you get it back on the registry. Now what?
Right.
Now what? I mean, what happens?
Well, it's protected from mountaintop removal. It's not protected from deforestation. It's not protected from drilling. These kinds of things can also really upset the surface. And for your listeners, uh, understanding that almost all of the archaeological findings on the battlefield are only a couple of inches below the soil. And this just happened 100 years ago. So all these guns and bullets and all these other things and defensive foxholes that were dug, it's all right there on the surface or right below the surface. So anything like timbering or bulldozing or anything like that really wipes out sections of the archaeological record. And that's why it's so significant to protect the surface from things like drilling or deforestation or timbering, these kinds of things. It's not protected from those kinds of things. And it's interesting that you bring that up. Obviously, there's no chance right now of a park being at Blair Mountain or whatever, because that's the company still own much of the land. But Friends of Blair, we're now trying to push a piece of federal legislation called the American Battlefield Preservation Act, in which, if it would get passed, or this is obviously very very early stages, but it's a piece of legislation we've drawn up that would protect all the battlefields on the National Register of Historic Places from surface disturbances, and create the Office of Battlefield Preservation, which would enable small museums, historic societies, and state parks to be able to fund a lot of their programs, archaeological research, and museums and staff positions through grant funding. So it's amazing how many battlefields around the United States are not only are they not protected well, they don't have local organizations that are really sharing the history. Things like Wounded Knee, the Wounded Knee Massacre, like one of the huge incidents took place on the frontier in Montana. There's like a tiny little group of like 4 people that look after part of the battlefield. We found a Native American battlefield in Missouri where they put a Dollar General in. Um, so a lot of these places, need protection, and they also need some kind of federal funding to help get some grassroots historical societies off the ground. So we're kind of going on a federal level now at this point in order to be able to find protection not only for Blair Mountain but for other really important sites. That includes, like 75 Civil War battlefields, about 20 American Revolutionary battlefields, about 23 battlefields that affect Native American heritage, like Little Bighorn. So that's the next big project, and that's the way to fully protect the site and provide some kind of federal funding for historic societies and museums to be able to educate the public and promote heritage tourism, which may be part of the solution for places like West Virginia. That's by no means an end all be all solution, but it could be a good part of the equation.
At the end of the day, the Battle of Blair Mountain was the culmination of a brutal system, a brutal system that kept workers down, wouldn't allow them to. I mean, you really couldn't do anything. I mean, if you're paid in company money, you can't travel. You're paid by the ton, so you're forced to basically every day slam it out. I mean, where do we go from here?
First of all, these miners obviously, grabbed their guns. They had turned to violence. They turned to radical action, radical direct action. Um, and what causes people to turn to radical action? Well, when they're denied, basic rights, whenever they can't provide for their families, whenever there's, I hate using the term economic uncertainty, but these miners that existed, 100 years ago, they didn't have their piece of the American pie. They couldn't have any upward mobility. It didn't matter how hard they worked or how much rugged individualism they had. They were stuck, right? So they fought. They turned to radical action. And when people, and I think for your viewers, and I think for everybody, this is something that must be learned. In the period from the 30s to the 70s, that was the period of the Union's strength, not just in West Virginia, but in America. That was also coincided with the largest expansion of the middle class in American history. And you didn't have workers. You didn't have, Walter Reuther of the United Auto Workers or John L. Lewis of the United Mine Workers calling for some kind of socialist revolution or calling for socialism in the United States. Um, and the reason you didn't have workers, the socialism, anarchism, these types of radical ideals, or even extreme right wing stuff like militia groups or some things like that, that didn't have any appeal whenever the middle class and unions are strong. Whenever what do we see happening right now? Well, the wealth gap is just as big as it was back at the time of the Battle of Blair Mountain. Okay, so it's reverted. The wealth gap closed in the middle and the later parts of the 20th century, and then it went back up again over the last 10, 20 years. So the wealth gap is the same. A lot of workers feel as though they're being left out in the cold, and at least feel as though they don't have any control over their lives. And so, what's happening? There's no unions. There are unions, but it's not very powerful. The wealth gap is huge, and what do you have? You have people turning to more radical ideologies. You have a more appeal of socialism among young people, and even more anarchist groups. And of course, you also have more reactionary stuff of people forming these militia groups. It's that unionism I feel very strongly is successful unionism not only helps out the middle class, but it's good for capitalism. Now, it may not be good for a corporation's bottom line in the short term, but in the long term, it's going to instead of labor movements being a gateway drug for Karl Marx, labor unions are actually successful labor unions actually de-radicalize workers because they're able to have a nice job and pay for their kids and maybe go to the beach once a year for a week. If they can do that, they don't want to change the system, right? They aren't going to fall into these extreme categories, and I think that's an important lesson to learn from this.
I always say this is that the best regulation is unionization. The free market gave birth to the idea of the capitalist corporation, and capitalist corporations gave birth to the idea of unionization. I think they go one and the same.
Yeah, and for many decades, the United Mine Workers was really the only voice in West Virginia that regulated the industry. The government certainly didn't do it, and it was the union itself that could keep the power of the industry in check. And so, yeah, I think the two are tied. I'm not going to go as far as to say that unions created the middle class, but unions helped solidify the success of the middle class, certainly in the United States.
Really, I mean, listening to this whole story of Blair Mountain and listening to what you went through just to save it, and the disconnect that the rest of the nation has from West Virginia, do you feel that having this concept that labor is more than just the workers doing the work, that unions could potentially be the one thing that could fix us, bring us together, unify us?
There's potential for that. I thought after the 2016 election, I fielded a lot of questions from journalists all over the country that just randomly called me, wanting the Trump country piece, the Trump country story, and somebody asked me about the labor movement, and I was not optimistic at all about the labor. In fact, I believe I said that the labor movement was on hospice in West Virginia, and I was wrong, and I was proven wrong by the West Virginia teachers strike. I was at the Capitol on the first day of the strike, not to participate in the strike. Actually, of college professors, but really weren't a part of the strike. I was there for History Day at the Capitol, which is this little day where all these little museums and history societies, set up little booths, and politicians walk around and shake your hand and act like they care. Uh, for a little bit. Uh, so we get there, and there's just hundreds and then thousands of teachers just showed up and packed the place. And um, these teachers that led the successful strike movement, and it was incredibly successful. And it was amazing how much enthusiasm there was over the course of just a couple of weeks. A type of union fervor that I had thought was possibly dead. Uh, it was encouraging to see. But one of the other things that I think that's important to note of that is a lot of these teachers that were on strike were conservatives. A lot of them had been people that had voted for Donald Trump, and so there were a lot of conservatives that went on strike that were as pro union as you can get. So the idea that unions are just for Democrats or anything like that, I think is just simply not true based on the evidence, based on what you see. And that is a place where if you get rid of a lot of the social issues that we argue about and some of these higher philosophical issues, if you agree that everybody should, be able to earn a decent wage and be able to have access to good health care and good pension plans and these kinds of things, then obviously I think you're going to find a lot of conservatives and liberals that are going to want to get on that boat. But it's very difficult getting over the rhetoric, the divisive rhetoric that's going on in this country right
What
now.
do you see as the future, not just of labor, But based on what you're doing, you're trying to save the battlefields. You're trying to save American, heritage, culture. I mean, culture is such an incredibly important thing to the survival of a nation, but also a society.
Mhm.
What do you see as the future?
Well, although I'm not a prophet, I can. Um, I see things that encourage me. The success of the Mind Wars Museum that other activists and I helped put together in Matewan, the first museum dedicated to this history. We started 5 years ago, or 6 years ago now, in 2015. And it's been incredibly successful. In fact, we just got mentioned in the New York Times today, our little museum. Uh, the fact that that can be successful, and a couple of small businesses have now, I think there's three small businesses that opened up in the little town of Matewan. Matewan is a little town, like 500 people. It's basically it looks like a little old western town, snuggled in the middle of these green mountains, a little tiny place. It was, when we first got there, it was all boarded up. There wasn't anything there. There was a pill clinic and a church, and that was in a little Mexican restaurant, and that was it. And since we've opened up and been successful, three small businesses have now opened up in the little downtown. More tourists are coming. People are coming into the region. So what does that mean? Number one, we've been able to reinsert the mine wars into the regional consciousness, and we can begin the process of getting people more in touch with their heritage, their labor heritage, and this different look at some big important part of American history. And at the same time, we showed that there can be a different type of economy other than coal in the region. So those are positive steps, but that still doesn't take away from the harsh realities of the fact that we've got a huge tax base which has been severely depleted. We don't have other big industries that are just coming in right away to replace that. So it's there are encouraging signs. I mentioned the teachers' strike and how a lot of the teachers wore red bandanas like the miners did, and a lot of teachers publicly on Facebook in the interviews talked about Blair Mountain when they talked about going on strike. That they had kind of taken some inspiration from that. So you can see that learning the history and making people aware of it can inspire people into action. The success of our little museum can show that there are economic alternatives, but but that means that if we roll up our sleeves and then over time we can turn a corner. But we're not turning the corner this year or next year. This is something that's going to take time before it gets any better, and we've got serious issues that are dealing. I mean, our government's how many trillions of dollars in debt right now? It's in the 20s. We've got climate change, which is going to be an increasing significant issue that's going to damage our infrastructure. So we've got real issues that aren't just going to go away because we're telling the history. But I think we can cling to this heritage in a way in which we can eventually turn the corner.
All right, Charles Keeney, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. The book is The Road to Blair Mountain, and where can they pick it up?
You can pick it up on Amazon or West Virginia University Press or any of the major online sites, and hopefully a local bookstore. But who knows about that? But you can definitely get it online.
Yeah, and I'll just say this: I started reading it, and I couldn't put it down the first day. It's an incredible book. It's an incredible read. I thought it was riveting. The whole process of trying to save something I had no idea was even this intricate. So, Chuck, thank you so much for coming on, and I appreciate your time.
I greatly appreciate you talking to me, and good luck. And thanks a lot. Appreciate the compliments on the book also.
Hey guys, thank you so much for listening to the podcast. If you're interested in learning more about Blair Mountain or supporting Friends of Blair Mountain organization, you can find them at friendsofblairmountain.org. Thank you so much for listening. Catch new episodes every Sunday evening. And I wanted to leave you with one last story from Chuck Keeney about his great grandfather. Thanks again, and let's get to work.
Well, when I think about Blair Mountain, I think about resiliency. I think about my great grandfather, and he started working in the mines as a little kid. He was 11 or 12 when he started working in the mines, and he almost got killed very early on. There was a mine shaft collapse, and the mule that was hauling coal went crazy, and it pushed him up, hit him up against the wall, and was crushing him to death. And in order to get the mule off him, he bit off the mule's ear. Um, and then the mule was able to let him go, and then he was able to crawl to safety after the mine collapse. My family has always said that was indicative of his character, that he was more stubborn than a mule. I think we kind of need some of that resiliency. Uh, and I think the story of Blair Mountain is a story of refusing to give in, of a story of uniting and fighting for your rights. Um, and that's what we need to have again. That our heritage, understanding the history of it, if we get rid of the romanticization, if we try to get rid of our political biases and look at the history as raw and as non-flinching as that we possibly can, then we can dispense with some of our preconceptions, and we can learn a better way, and learn from some serious mistakes, and kind of maybe get a better perspective. So I hope that in preserving the history, that that's what it will do, and I hope that people will come to West Virginia and see how complicated it is. It's so much more complicated than just bare political rhetoric and campaign slogans, and that we're going to need many solutions. And labor is part of that, organized labor is part of that. And I think we're going to need liberals and we're going to need conservatives to uh, put aside our hatreds in order to make any of this work.